Oh, there is blessing in this gentle breeze, a visitant that while it fans my cheek, doth seem half conscious of the joy it brings, from the green fields and from yon azure sky. Whatever its mission, the soft breeze can come, to none more grateful than to me, escaped from the vast city where I long had pined, a discontented sojourner, now free, free as a bird to settle where I will. What dwelling shall receive me? And what vale shall be my harbor? Underneath what grove shall I take up my home? And what clear stream shall with its murmur lull me into rest? The earth is all before me, with a heart joyous nor scared at its own liberty.
This is Pints with Jack, Season 8, Episode 27, Jack's Bookshelf, William Wordsworth. After Hours with Dr. Carolyn Weber. Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. This season, we've read through Perelandra, but this month we're looking at Jack's Bookshelf. In each of these sessions, we look at the authors and the books which shaped the thought and mind of C.S. Lewis. And today we are looking at one of the Romantics, William Wordsworth. And I'm joined by a returning guest, Dr. Carolyn Weber. Dr. Carolyn Weber is an award-winning author, popular professor, and international speaker. She has served as faculty at several universities and was the first female dean of St. Peter's College, Oxford. She lives in a quirky old house out in the country with her family, along with her animal menagerie. And she is the author of Surprised by Oxford, Sex and the City of God, and Holy is the Day. Dr. Carolyn Weber, welcome back to Pints with Jack.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great fun.
Well, we actually had a really good catch-up just before we hit record. But we mostly spoke about immigration and the joys of becoming an American. What have you been up to since you were last on the show?
Oh, gosh, quite a bit. I'm working on 2 other book projects, some related to what I love to do with students and the art of asking questions in terms of faith, and also the intersection of faith and literature and reading. And been pretty busy with my students, teaching a heavy load and really enjoying my time with them at New College Franklin. They're just delightful students there. My oldest has started college. She's actually attending there too. So that's a big, big step. Oh my gosh, David. Our first one. So she's just a delight and really enjoying her studies. And then our twin boys are pretty busy. It's baseball season right now, travel baseball season. So they live and breathe that. And our littlest guy, partially homeschooling him as well. So it's been busy and a full-time, but a good one in many ways, and also a bittersweet one. We did lose my mom since I saw you last, who installed a love for me in literature. I had wonderful time with her, and she loved the Lord too. So again, it's a bittersweet thing, but it's a delight to be here because she actually was the one who introduced me to Wordsworth.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Well, that is very appropriate. Well, I am drinking a West Coast IPA from Best Day Brewing.
Ooh.
And you've been sick a lot recently. So
I've been in the sinus area of Tennessee, so I have my tea.
Excellent choice. And let's toast to your mum. Cheers.
Oh, thank you.
So William Wordsworth, what do we know about him, and where does he sort of fit in the whole scheme of English literature?
Oh, huge question. Well, he's probably one of the most famous Romantic poets. I had the privilege actually of having Jonathan Wordsworth, a descendant of William Wordsworth, teach me at Oxford. And I can still remember he was delightfully eccentric, lived and breathed Wordsworth. I mean, as you would imagine, right, of an Oxford professor, but I guess apparently quite physically similar to Wordsworth. William Wordsworth himself was a physically imposing man, I guess very tall, very fit, walked a lot. Those are my memories of Jonathan Wordsworth. He has since passed away, which is a sad thing, but he was really, I mean, he would teach us Wordsworth without opening a book. You know, I mean, we just lived and breathed it and knew everything about it and about him. And I had the delight of visiting the cottages, Dove Cottage, Dorset as well, and actually staying and working with a few fellow students at the Wordsworth Cottage. So Wordsworth is very dear to me. Grew up reading him, loving him. But when I studied, particularly at Oxford, he was what was considered probably the main 5 canonical Romantic poets, separate from the women writers. But I think it would be Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley, and Byron. So he is an anchor to the Romantic movement. And he lived so long, David. You know, he lived, I think, 1770 to 1850. So He lived across the first and second generation of Romantic poets, those that were shaped by the French Revolution and those that then responded afterwards to it, sometimes cynically, sometimes disenchantedly. So he has a really interesting career as well. So he's a fascinating poet.
Now, you mentioned the word romantics a few times. I've used it as well. I will completely admit that I had no idea who the romantics were until I started reading Lewis and started hearing him talk about them. So would you mind just, in broad strokes, just explaining who the romantics were and what characterized them and the waves that you've mentioned?
Yes, because I know Lewis really talks about them a lot too. So in short, it was the group of writers I decided to focus on for my graduate studies because I was really attracted to their interest in longing, or what Lewis calls Sehnsucht, the sort of human longing or homesickness for our soul that we're reminded by joy and by beauty. So I would think chronologically, they're sort of loosely defined as maybe 1750 to 1850, depending on whether you're looking at the long 18th century or not, and often identified as coming out of Germany and the German Romantic movement earlier on with Goethe, and this Sturm und Stress movement, the Sturm und Drang, and then infiltrating the British Romantics, probably from about the 1780s till about the 1820s or 30s would be the height of Romanticism. And again, this kind of first and second generation. So the first generation being very much interested in utopias and in idealism and in nature and in probably in the face of the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and looking at a way of understanding nature as a ways to understanding man. So I would say the earlier younger Wordsworth, the earlier younger Coleridge, and then William Blake, those writers. The second generation, what's interesting, Mary Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, John Keats, Lord Byron, actually shaped in many ways. It's kind of like the career of the Beatles, shaped in a way by the earlier writers, in that generation. And so they're really defined by revolution. They lived and witnessed many revolutions, French, American, Greek, so there's a revolution in language, democracy, the common man, common language, a much more accessible poetry, also an interest in emotion and psychology and human nature, the interior life, subjectivity, and in many ways redemption, but redemption now perhaps through the imagination. So there's a secularization of that. So they're a really fascinating group because a lot is happening with them. I really found them to be such a fascinating shift from, the Shakespearean or Miltonic mind to the modern one.
Now, I was first introduced to the Romantics as a result of reading The Great Divorce and Lewis's reference to Blake and me then sort of chasing that tree back up. And although the Romantics seem to get into some very odd sort of places and being more antagonistic towards religion, it seems that that's not how it always began for all of them, that it is still a very broad movement, even from the beginning. And we open this episode with you reading the opening section to the prelude, which I've actually been listening to on audiobook. Just before I shut down my Audible subscription, they've got the entirety of the prelude there. So that's now typically what I'm listening to as I'm driving over to the coffee shop each morning to get my coffee.
That's impressive.
Well, the thing that's actually rather nice is there's been some building work near our house, so I actually now have to take a ridiculously long route home. So what should be a 7-minute drive is now a 20-minute drive on the way back, and it actually forces me through the country. And so it actually has been working out really rather nicely.
Oh, it's wonderful to listen to the prelude going through the country, and you need 20 minutes. You need longer time. The prelude's long.
Oh, true, but you got to concentrate as he's going through, because the text is beautifully rich. As I'm listening to it, quite often a word or phrase will really jump out at me. I was actually almost tempted to do the next bit of the prelude where he speaks about being able to breathe again, given that you've been sick. So I was going to that jumped out at me the other day.
I have a love-hate relationship with nature and pollen right now.
Yes. But his descriptions of nature and finding a home there and something that's restorative and fleeing from the city and finding his place in nature, it's really beautiful. And as someone that's read an awful lot more of Lewis than the Romantics, I can sort of see why Lewis liked him in particular and the Romantics in general so much.
Absolutely. I can see that too, because one thing I've loved about Wordsworth, and I identify very much, maybe even as a Canadian who comes from the Great Lake area, and I love the Great Lakes. He hailed from the Lake District, in West England, and beautiful area and mountainous and everything else. And that was always his great love. So he was a person of place and loved nature. That shaped his poetry, which I think was also new and fresh for its time as well. But I think Lewis as well was a great walker and loved being in nature and loved thinking in nature and walking every day. And so was Wordsworth. So, and I identify with that. I love walks. I love nature, being out in nature. And I think that time frame too of just that growing anxiety about the Industrial Revolution, the dark satanic mills, as William Blake calls them, encroaching on things. There was this drawback to less artifice. And that would, that later will influence the American transcendentals and your Thoreau and Emerson and that too. But that nature could be a guide. Nature could be a nurse, something that can heal us, that we've lost something, but there's abundant recompense for going back and finding it through nature in terms of how it causes us to meditate and be sort of removed from the hustle and bustle and anonymity of the rising modern life.
So would you mind telling us a little bit about his career? So you said he grew up in the Lake District. Did he stay there? Did he move to the city to try and win his fortune?
No, he didn't. I mean, he largely always stayed in very beautiful areas. He was really shaped by the Western England and the countryside there. His mom passed away, like Lewis, young, when he was about 9, so close to the same age. And he was very close to his sister, Dorothy Wordsworth, very famously. He actually dictated many of his poems to her. He didn't like writing. And so she was his muse, as many of these women were. But he was separated from her then when I think he went to live with grandparents and she went somewhere, it often happened. And then he did enjoy his studies with his brothers. And he did go to some really beautiful, wonderful schools. He had some good teachers, but he was always drawn to the countryside. And later, I think he was probably most prolific when he lived at Dove Cottage and was immersed in the beautiful countryside there. That really inspired much of his poetry. So he really didn't have a taste for this urban at all. Very much remained in places he walked every day up until his 70s, in nature as well. A lot of people don't know that he loved France. During the French Revolution, he actually had kind of this fling with France, and also had a fling with Annette Villon, a woman in France, and had an illegitimate daughter with her named Caroline. Many think is probably why he didn't marry his wife for many years until that was kind of settled. He didn't know what to do, and he was separated from that daughter too. But he was really disenchanted by what happened with France, and really disenchanted with what happened with Napoleon. So there was these early years where he was really shaped. I think many of them went and had kind of a love affair with France, in this French Revolution. But then
they lost their heads, and other people lost theirs literally. Yeah.
Literally, yeah. So that I think he was very deeply affected by, that France could kind of end up being a threat, to his beloved Britain too.
And what was his success like? Was he the struggling artist that wasn't really recognized until the end of his career or after his death, or was he recognized pretty early on?
Well, if I remember correctly, I think he did have some accolades early on, but he was more celebrated later in his life. He was somewhat disenchanted for a period in between. He collaborated very famously with Samuel Taylor Coleridge on the Lyrical Ballads, and which was a seminal publication. So I always tell my students, it's just hard for us to understand how political a poetical publication can be. Say that 5 times fast. It came out 1798 with an additional preface and tweaks and things, 1802, very popular, it was a collection of poems, opened with The Ancient Mariner by Coleridge, really. And if you think about even the name Lyrical Ballads, you're going from this urbane, highly polished, very sort of tradition of epic poetry or rhyming couplets or formalized poetry or very stylized themes and ideas. You're looking at your Johnson or Blake or Johnson or Pope or whatnot from the neoclassical writers to now poems about leech gatherers, fishermen, an old man traveling to, get his son's body who's fought in the war, little children playing outside cottages, a solitary reaper working in the fields. So he takes these common figures, often isolated or lowly figures, and sets them in these poems against this great, vast, beautiful backdrop of nature, or Michael or the ruined cottage, kind of the idea of how vast nature is and how small we are in the midst of it. Very German, but also I think when we look at lyrical ballads, how radical that was, that he collaborated with Coleridge. They were great friends, and he very much appreciated and admired him, even when they had a bumpy relationship over the years. But it was radically different, Coleridge writing these kind of supernatural ballads and dealing with the imagination being somewhat unpredictable and dark at times, and his deep Christian faith, but also a faith that he battled depression and illness. And then you have Wordsworth, in which nature is redemptive, working on this collection. So it was such a radically different collection. He defined poetry, Wordsworth defined it as emotion recollected in tranquility. I mean, that's a radical thing to be saying at that time. And so that emphasis again on emotion, when we've had so much emphasis in the Enlightenment on reason, the beauty of the natural world, and on the inner life, inner landscape.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thought, particularly when you connect it to Lewis and his somewhat distrust of emotion, knowing that it could lead you to some very bad places, but yet he loved an author that explored and celebrated it.
I know, because I think in Wordsworthian poetry there is a sense of much longing, and in Tintern Abbey, for instance, where he writes that beautiful poem about going back to the place that he grew up with his sister, and then revisiting it later, 5 years later, in 5 long summers. And I think we all resonate with going back to a place in our childhood that, you go back to your school you went to as a child and everything's so much smaller, that you remember, you're like this little tiny water fountain and everything, but you go back to something and it has changed, and you grieve that change and you grieve that loss and how it was magical, or there was, you didn't think about things. You didn't bring this consciousness, he talks about bounding through, the natural environment, like something being pursued, and then going back later and you feel and experience it so differently, because now you have lost that childhood vision, but it's been replaced by the sad music of humanity. And so now you come back understanding suffering or experience, and you can't go back to what you had as a child, but you've had this other compensation now happen. Something redemptive happens that way. And so Wordsworth, that's fairly formulaic. It's almost really quite dependable. For Coleridge, not so. So they were an interesting combination. I can see why Lewis would be attracted to that. I mean, he took the name of his memoir from a poem by Wordsworth, Surprised by Joy.
As impatient as the wind.
Yes, it's a beautiful poem.
Actually, could you just tell us about that poem? We're not going to do Surprise. We were originally going to be doing Surprised by Joy next season, but I'm still waiting for David Downing to finish his annotated book, so I don't have to do quite so much research.
The Downings are lovely.
Yeah. But would you mind just saying a few words, just contextualize that particular poem?
I mean, I can read it.
Well, actually, that was one of my other questions. I was going to ask you if you wouldn't mind actually reading one of your favorite sections. So let's kill 2 birds with one stone and do that.
Surprised by Joy. Yeah, surprised by joy, impatient as the wind, I wished to share the transport, oh, with whom? But thee, long buried in the silent tomb, that spot which no vicissitude can find. Love, faithful love, recalled thee to my mind. But how could I forget thee? Through what power, even for the least division of an hour, have I been so beguiled as to be blind to my most grievous loss? That thought's return was the worst pang that sorrow ever bore, save one only, when I stood forlorn, knowing my heart's best treasure was no more, that neither present time nor years unborn could to my sight that heavenly face restore. And so I think it's such a beautiful poem, because it's about grief, and catching ourselves, enjoying something and then
Yeah.
remembering that we're enjoying something while we've had this loss and that we will never encounter that face again.
Mm.
And that sort of pang of really painful beauty. But I think with Lewis, I don't know, I've struggled with why he chose that poem. I think in a way because it did encapsulate that longing
Mm-hmm.
and that pun of him being surprised by the actual joy, rush, the joy that he met,
Mm-hmm.
Joy Davidman. But I think also that for the Christian, the tomb isn't empty, is empty. And that actually has a different reason than the tomb for those who don't believe in the resurrection. So it's a poem about grief and loss, but for the Christian, there's also a necessity to the tomb and something beautiful about the empty tomb as well.
And I think there is also something about Sehnsucht that it sneaks up on you when you didn't expect it. And in that poem, he's enjoying something beautiful and wants to share it. And suddenly it's like, oh, but there's this loss. There's this person that I want to share this with, and I can't. But even in the remembering of it, that still remembering that person that you loved brings you something that you actually don't want to let go of.
Right.
The stabs of joy, it can feel like a loss, but you're still glad that you're having those stabs, even if they're painful.
Even if they're painful, right? It is, it is a privilege to grieve.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something even in the grief that reminds you that you're missing something and also loving something. And it's interesting when you mention that notion of like kind of it being a serendipity, because that's what Wordsworth, he talks, the sublime was a very important aesthetic for the Romantics. The sublime being the idea of both awe and fear being held in the same moment. So a sublime moment would be the mountaintop, standing at the top and you're both slightly nauseous as you look with vertigo, but you're also amazed at the vista and how those two can be held in one hand. It's a very paradoxical aesthetic experience. And there was quite a bit of excitement about the sublime. And Wordsworth actually, as a younger self, decides to go walking in the Alps in search of the sublime. He's going to go find it. Like this is like a Winnie the Pooh moment or something, and can't find it because it's exactly that. It actually later sneaks up on him, which I believe he writes about in the Prelude, and says, it's when you're not expecting it at one point, that the clouds descended on him unexpectedly. He's surrounded in fog and then it lifts and he's about to fall to his death, but it's incredibly beautiful. So you can't conjure it of your own accord. In a sense, there is a grace, a blessing, a mysticism in it that's not within our control, which makes it all the more beautiful.
And since Andrew's not here, I'm going to have to give the Till We Have Faces reference. When I hear that poem, it's like Orwell as she's going up the mountain and she hears, "Why should your heart not dance?" And she fights it because she has lost Psyche and she thinks that's the reason that she shouldn't dance. And you also hear echoes in there of Lewis and a grief observed after he's coming to terms with Joy Davidman's death. Well, you said that your mum introduced you to Wordsworth. When was that? How did that go? Because I've actually started reading to Alexander at breakfast time, small portions of poems. I've been mainly doing Gerard Manley Hopkins because it's all about sound rather than actual comprehension.
Yes.
So how was that for you with your mum?
My mum would take us to the bookmobile. Bookmobiles are very exciting.
I grew up in a little village. I know what the bookmobile is.
You do?
Yeah.
Do they have them anymore?
I don't think so. Oh, well, actually, no. Actually, that's not entirely true. I know that they do have it in some places because my mother lives in quite a rural area. Okay. And there is a library near her house, but I know that they have a van that goes out to the surrounding area to like satellite sites of village halls and such, and set up there so people can get books without having to traipse all the way to the big town to get to go to the library.
Like that wonderful book Parnassus on Wheels. Like there's a delight. It is such a delightful, fun thing to do. And there's something very exciting about going into the bookmobile and getting your treasured book and then like taking it back and it coming to you. It's very exciting. And my mom would take us to the bookmobile and my mom was always reading us fun things, introduced us to poetry young too, especially for the sound. She would do Robert Louis Stevenson, How I Love to Go Up in the Air so blue, things like that I really think are treasures for children to love the sound and to love the images and to have something that's pure and clean and beautiful for them imaginatively, that's not political, and not tethered by stuff, for them to be able to have their own imaginative world. And so she often favored Wordsworth. I remember one of the first poems she had us memorize as children was "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man, so be it when I shall grow old or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety." So she would choose short poems. The short poems by Wordsworth are very beautiful. "Wandered lonely as a cloud," those ones. And they also gave such a window into, like, I still look at rainbows and my heart leaps up. And I mean, they are beautiful. Actually, I remember the day coming home from the hospital when my daughter was born, there was a double rainbow in the sky, which was incredible. But like, my heart does leap up at them. And so like, there is this gift we give children, I think, in making words their friends in that sense, and a refuge and a comfort for them, and a place for them to have magic at place. But Wordsworth was a favorite. Solitary Reaper, one of her other favorites. "Behold her single in the field yon solitary, Highland lass bending and reaping." And this idea of, I think Wordsworth is really able to transport you to focusing on one particular figure or one particular moment. The Solitary Reaper is such a beautiful poem because the poet's almost like this voyeur looking at a woman working in the field, and she's singing an old Gaelic song. He doesn't even know the words or what they mean, but he's moved by the melody, and he's moved by what that must mean for her and the history behind all of it, and her working as she's doing this. So in a way, it lifts up a regular person, and a person who normally wouldn't have been vaulted in poetry, but it also has this sort of beautiful holiness to the valley vision, and then he says, "Along in my heart, I bore the music," so he carries it in his heart forever after witnessing it in this valley. It's like the Orphic myth, going down and getting that magic and bringing it back up.
Getting the beloved and bringing it back up.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what makes Wordsworth so important, that there were all of these shifts in poetry that he and his colleagues were part of? I mean, what is it that you would say that actually makes him an important author?
Well, he was definitely a vibrant heart of a coterie, quite a powerful group. I mean, I think there's no other period that rivals the Romantics in how many writers there were that all knew each other and were writing in relationship and writing in response to each other. Part of that, I think, was shaped by the revolutionary language, of the French and then later American, or both of them together, of that responding to each other in revolutionary discussion. But that, Robert Southey and Coleridge and Wordsworth, and I think of Walter Scott and James Hogg, like all these, they all knew each other. I mean, and obviously the famous ghostwriting story of Mary Shelley with, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron and Polidori and, all of those, and Keats, they all knew and responded to each other and were writing in ways together. So in a sense, part of a really, really rich time for those kind of ideas that I don't think we'll see again. We now have social media, but there's not quite, that same sort of people traveling to write and work together, and meet each other and mentor with each other, and then possibly run off with each other's daughters. I mean, that's what happened with, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Godwin, but I digress. So, like there's this, they were just interesting. Like, honestly, I sit at home in my bunny pajamas in the winter and, I have this vicarious life through the Romantics because they were crazy.
Yeah.
Interesting. They're not boring at all, but just fascinating. I think with Wordsworth, his longevity, he lived so long that he lived over several of these generations of writers. And it was later in his life that he was celebrated as a poet laureate, later in his life that he really, I think, more of his poetry was recognized and came into its own. But really such a radical break from poetic tradition, still adherent to form, still, very much a blank verse or rhythm, not the kind of break we're going to get with T.S. Eliot in that.
He was in my head right now. He's one of the other people that we're doing in this month of Jack's Bookshelf. And my wife and I read each other quite a lot of Eliot poetry in preparation for that. And our conclusion was, there are some bright moments, but in general, not a fan. Don't like the lack of structure at all.
Well, and I think Lewis would agree with you, and then grew to have a warmer relationship with each
Yeah.
other. And I've grown to like Eliot more and more as I get older. I think I identify more and more with what he was saying and recreating with the fragmentation of modern experience. When I first read him, I didn't enjoy him as much. I found him very alienating, but maybe I sense now more of what he was doing and why. And actually, I think at the heart, he was a romantic.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just need to get older. But yeah, we
That'll
read.
happen.
Hopefully. But we read Prufrock, and there are a few in that book that we rather liked. But oh no, it was, to me, it was night and day, because I did Eliot first because I was interviewing our guest before you, and then I switched to Wordsworth, and I was just like, oh yeah, I feel like I could got room to stretch and breathe with Wordsworth. And you just like a little like my little daughter, when she just raises her hands, it's like, pick me up.
Oh,
that's how it felt.
That's true. That's true. But Wordsworth lived in a very different time. And yet, I mean, you read Ash Wednesday or you read Journey of the Magi by T.S. Eliot. And I think Journey of the Magi is one of the most moving poems I know of. To call a poem an event or an experience, I think that you have to enter it in a different way. But yeah, he's writing, I think, in response to those things and showing the pastness of the past and our break with it and lamenting that. But also, I think in many ways, I've grown to appreciate him much more. And I think Lewis did too.
Well, you've spoken about how the Romantics influenced each other. Were there any other really formative influences on Wordsworth? Either other people who were outside of the Romantics or the books that he himself read?
Well, of course, he read voraciously. And I would say Milton and Shakespeare had, the greatest influence overall on the Romantics as a group as a whole, but of course on Wordsworth. And he was, I think there was always a tension between him and Robert Southey, because he was the poet laureate initially, and there was this kind of competitiveness he had a great admiration for Walter Scott. He had a great admiration for the Scottish Romantic writers. So, we have George MacDonald in that lot and James Hogg. I would say, and also greatly influenced by Plato. Like some of his contemporaries, the most popular translations of Plato at the time were by Thomas Taylor, who was an interesting translator because he was controversial for translating not so much by letter as by idea.
Like a dynamic translation.
A dynamic translation. And so if you read Thomas Taylor's translations that were on their bookshelves, they were really interesting because they were sort of very fascinated in transmigration and the notion of the soul and this sort of thing, which I think was really at the heart of the Intimations Ode, that our life is but a sleep and a forgetting, sort of fascination with the idea where the soul has been and where it's going, which I think would have also spoken to C.S. Lewis, but that kind of longing of our souls and that homesickness that we have for it.
And also that in that famous painting where Plato is pointing up and Aristotle is pointing down, I feel like Wordsworth, now that you mention it, he is always pointing up. He's always trying to lift you up into that something else, rather than necessarily sort of digging down into the nitty gritty.
But he sidesteps a redeemer, So he's, I think in a way, this is also what's problematic about the Romantics as well, is that they take you only so far. And in many ways, though, nature and those kind of things have supplanted. There's M.H. Abrams writes that seminal book, the natural supernaturalism, but there's this almost sacredization of the secular.
Let's try and get some religious feelings from nature since we've rejected religion.
Yeah.
Lewis has his own warnings about that in The Four Loves. He says, when you go to nature, you'll find what you're looking for. Would you mind just giving us a quick sketch of Wordsworth's corpus? What did he write? Was it all poetry? And do we have all of it, or are there lost books that people are still hunting for?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I think it was predominantly poetry. He did write some lyrical dramas, which became more common at the time, which is interesting, is the Romantics are not known for their plays. They're known for what was called their lyrical dramas. So they were plays, but not meant to be as performed as much as read.
Okay.
So Percy Bysshe Shelley very famously wrote Prometheus Unbound, which was the missing Aeschylus, response to Prometheus Bound. So there's these imagined plays. Wordsworth dabbled in some of that. He and Coleridge went through a time where they were interested in German literature and plays as well. But I think predominantly poetry. I can't think off the top of my head of an extended novel he wrote. But his poetry is interesting because some of it's very, very short.
And as I'm finding out with the prelude, some of it's very, very long.
Some of it's very long. And the prelude is a perfect example of something that he actually worked on for a good part of his life, but he did not publish it till 40 years after he finished it.
I bet Tolkien liked him. It's like,
yes.
that's a man after my own heart.
Yeah, but he did write many different types of poems. So some poems are not as long as a prelude, of course, and the prelude was kind of his attempt at that kind of modern epic in a way, but publishing it so much later in his life. Intimations of being very long, but then many of these, he wrote many sonnets too. Sometimes people forget about his sonnets. His sonnets are really beautiful, and there's very much a Shakespearean influence there. I don't think he was as influenced by the metaphysical poets as Coleridge was. Certainly, an appreciation for Donne and Herbert and that, but not, I think, this to the same degree as devotional poetry. Did definitely have an interest in Spenser and in those Dante and that too. But again, I wouldn't say to the same extent that it held a fascination for, say, the Shelleys. Mary Shelley adored Dante, so there was a great influence from the Greek myths and tragedies and that as well. But I think it's fascinating the different types of poems he wrote.
We've mentioned quite a few of the important ones. Just what are the top shelf poems, be they short or long, that you think people should at least know about?
Oh gosh, well, I think you have to read the lyrical ballads.
Okay.
Because they are so groundbreaking when you think about when they were written at this time. Because, as I said, they're subjective, they're nationalistic in a way, looking at these common people from a sort of a common nations coming up as a new English voice, written in this accessible language. And the lyrical ballads, famous for Tintern Abbey, the collection ends with Tintern Abbey. Tintern Abbey is such a beautiful and important seminal work, I think, for the power of memory as well. The idea that we can be transported back and recover things recollected, right? Emotion recollected in tranquility. The power of memory to restore things. The romantic fascination with the memory. What is memory? And looking at the faculty, which is going to be, I think, precede how philosophy eventually transforms into psychology, right? This is going to anticipate Freud in that as well later. When he says the child is father of the man, what are we learning as children? This is growing out of Rousseau and everything as well, that whole radical movement around education. Mary Wollstonecraft, Rousseau, even Godwin to some extent, the education of the child is going to dictate the future citizen. He was very much fascinated in that. So I would highly recommend reading the poems and lyrical ballads, because he has also his poems about children are fascinating. The Lucy Gray poems, and many scholars have thought were in many ways masked poems for Annette Vallon, who he couldn't be with as an illegitimate relationship, and also being separated from her I think he didn't see her for something like 9 years when he first got to see his child again, Caroline, and that weighed on him in many ways. And that's when he actually wrote many of these poems. So sometimes they're seen sort of as masking some of that for him. But We Are Seven is a really interesting poem where it's a narrator, most likely an adult male, who's speaking to a young child outside a cottage, a young poor child. And it's a very fascinating poem because they're bantering back and forth. She's saying she has 6 siblings in herself. And he's saying, but, some of them are dead. So there's only, 5 of you or whatever. And she insists that there's 7. And they battle back and forth. And it's a really interesting poem looking at the differences in spiritual math. For the child, the siblings are present. It doesn't matter that they're buried in the churchyard. It doesn't matter that one's lost at sea. In her math, in this imaginative and spiritual math, the children are alive and her siblings are all present. And this sort of quite difficult, rationalistic, heavy-handed man is battling with her that, but they're dead. They're dead. There's only this many of you. And in a way, it's a disturbing poem. Sometimes my students get their knickers in a knot about how could, an older man harass a younger girl like that with her math. But it's also a really touching poem about really the differences in how we see things.
Mm.
And another poem that's incredibly beautiful is Nutting. And it's about basically being a younger man going out and, they would take their staffs, and nutting is when you knock all the nuts off the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about going out and being brash and doing this. And isn't it exciting? And, you're collecting all these nuts and you're going home with all this bounty. And then actually you basically, in a sense, rape these trees, and it's violent, and the tree is standing there at the end in this silence. And he says, but let's, hush, there's a spirit in the woods, that we have in many ways inflicted this violence on the natural world for this greed. And there's still this forgiving spirit. Very beautiful.
I want to know if the author of The Giving Tree had that in mind when they wrote their story.
Yes, could. I mean, it's also, he did an 1807 collection of poems. That's, I think, the one in which the Solitary Reaper is in as well. So the lyrical ballads are very beautiful and really groundbreaking, but I think it was the 1807 that has more of those poems in which he's really reflecting on specific things. Old Man Traveling is a beautiful poem as well, of describing this old man that is walking this lonely road to visit his son who has fallen in war, or to collect his body, resolution and independence. So he wrote on these topics that were ordinary, everyday topics. The leech gatherer, this man gathering leeches to make a living, that are really moving and really shine the light on these very poor ways of making a living that had not previously been deemed worthy of poetic material.
As you were talking about that poem with the man arguing with a small child, as a father of two toddlers, I know that's a foolish errand. You're gonna lose.
Yeah, that's so
Even
true.
if you win, you're gonna lose.
You know what? They probably actually would really like that poem, because you have to give the little girl in it, she has got chutzpah, and she does not back down. She battles him, kind of on this spiritual argument with this spiritual math. Tables Turned is another wonderful poem, where basically it's a really interesting self-reflective poem for a poet to write, because he says, in many ways we read too much, we study too much, like put down your books and go outside. There's this, my students also love that one, when there's homework assigned, and it's kind of a great reason not to do it. But there was almost this sense that we can overthink, or we can produce too many books, or, we're not in nature enough.
Well, he's been at the background of our conversation throughout, but with all of these episodes on Jack's bookshelf, I have to ask the question, in what ways do you think this author influenced C.S. Lewis?
Oh, well, as I said earlier, I think predominantly he would have identified with Wordsworth's love for the land. That Lewis was so happy at the kilns and on that little beautiful piece of property, just like Wordsworth was really in heaven at the Dove Cottage with his sister, reunited with his sister, and reminded him so much of the countryside and that he grew up with. I think the fact that they both lost their mothers at around the same age, and in some ways there's some sympathies in Wordsworth's poetry about that. I think the impact of Lewis's loss of his mother hasn't been examined enough academically, that I think that was a really formative force for him, and something that I think also shaped Wordsworth too. And I think that for Wordsworth, there is this touching on the longing, David, that like in this spirit in the woods, this longing that we have for where our soul has been, that we see in Plato, as well, and something like the Phaedo, or in even Socrates himself, who kicked poets out of the Republic, writing poetry on his deathbed, that would have spoken to Lewis with Wordsworth. It's just interesting, because I think he probably takes Wordsworth even a step further in something like Surprised by Joy, because Wordsworth, I think, was famously sort of known as having said on his deathbed, I have no need of a redeemer, right? So there was like this relationship with redemption, and nature as being redemptive and the imagination as being redemptive, but kind of a wariness of, or not maybe a return to overt Christianity in the same way that maybe Coleridge dealt with. And so for Wordsworth, probably being really attractive to Lewis in those ways the natural world, the sense of longing, the sense of beauty, the sublime. But Wordsworth probably not being quite enough, as Lewis, I think, shows in Till We Have Faces, that there has to be that moment in which the veil is lifted.
Well, if someone has never read any Wordsworth, we've spoken about a lot of different collections and individual poems, but if someone has never picked up Wordsworth before, where would you recommend they begin?
I would recommend lyrical ballads. And some of those poems are by Coleridge, obviously, but not. The preface to lyrical ballads is written predominantly by Wordsworth, I think solely. And the preface to lyrical ballads is probably one of the most famous poetical prefaces. So, of course, the poems in there are beautiful, and the 1807 collection later too. But the preface is really interesting. It's really, really interesting because he actually sets it almost as a treatise as to why he's using this common language, why the subject matter, the definition of poetry, the definition of the poet, almost setting up the poet as the Christ figure, the poet that is going to be the mediator for helping us see things anew and connecting us to the natural world, and in many ways the Redeemer. And so I think the preface is really, even though it's written in prose, is a really important thing to read to understand Wordsworth and perhaps to be introduced to him. And then I would work up to reading the longer poems, perhaps after enjoying the shorter ones, just because the shorter ones are such beautiful poems that kind of throw you into the natural world immediately. The longer ones, some of them can actually be fairly philosophical, but also, even a poem like Michael can be, there can be quite a bit of sadness and quite a bit of needing to enter the story into it. The prelude can be intimidating, because it is like an epic.
Yeah.
But not an epic figure, but, like an epic attempt.
Epic in size.
Probably one of my favorites is I would say Tintern Abbey for sure. And Intimation's Ode.
Excellent. Dr. Carolyn Weber, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. What a delight.
As we wrap up, can you tell us where people can go to find out more about you and pick up your books?
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I have a website, carolynweber.com. That's probably the easiest place to pop by. And my books are available. There's links there as well as to Amazon as well. And the film version of Surprised by Oxford is available now worldwide on Amazon Prime and on Apple TV.
Wonderful. And listeners, we are going to be moving from Wordsworth to Kenneth Grahame next week with Dr. Landon Lofton. And in this episode, you heard about the spirit of the woods. Well, there it gets really, really real in one of the most wonderful and disturbing scenes of my childhood reading. I'm just gonna leave it as that. If you've read The Wind in the Willows, you probably can guess which section that is, but we'll talk about that more next week.
Oh, I can probably guess. You need a visit from the bookmobile.
And as I hear the call for final drinks, I'd like to thank our intern, Julia, our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, all of our patron supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Dan, Jody, Robert, Mark, Rowdy, Angela, David, Peter, Kate, James, John, Sarah, Rebecca, Meg and Brian, Joanna, Kelly, Stephen, Gary, Paul, Kay, Becca, Shane, Thomas, Amanda, Joelle, Erica, Matt, James, Bud, Aldo, Kevin, and Mark. And of course, to all of you for listening. All the co-hosts, we pray for you every single time we release an episode. And if you've enjoyed this episode, maybe you could just wander lonely as a cloud for a little bit of today. And please join us again next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers!
Cheers!